Hi, fourth graders. Welcome to the Middle Ages, Chapter 1. We're going to read this chapter to learn about the time period in history called the Middle Ages, and we will be able to identify the events that led up to the Middle Ages. So, here on this page we see our big question. What are some of the events that led to the Middle Ages? When we are finished reading this today, we're going to be doing an activity page that asks us to list the events that led to the Middle Ages. All right, here we go. If you know anything about knights, castles, or Robin Hood, then you already know something about the Middle Ages in Europe. The Middle Ages may seem to be an unusual name for a historical period, especially one that lasted for more than 1,000 years. People in the Middle Ages did not know they were in the middle of anything. They thought they were modern, just as you and I do today. In fact, the Middle Ages was not a phrase used by the people who lived during that time. It is a term modern historians use today to refer to the time period between ancient and modern times. Remember, the term Middle Ages was introduced by current historians to explain that this time period is between ancient times and modern times. But at the time of the Middle Ages, it was not known as the Middle Ages. Okay, next page. We begin our journey into medieval Europe, another name for the Middle Ages, by examining some key events that happened long before this age began. We're going to pause and I'm going to highlight the word medieval right here. Medieval is an adjective that describes things related to the Middle Ages. So you might hear the Middle Ages referred to as medieval times. All right. The first major event that helped transform Western Europe occurred when the mighty Roman Empire, having grown too big for one emperor to rule, broke apart into the eastern and western parts of the empire. This division had a major impact on Western Europe. With the Roman Empire split into two parts, different tribes took the opportunity to seize some of its lands. Interestingly, some of these people were given the name barbarian from the Latin word barbarus, meaning foreigner or not Roman. The Romans may have considered these people to be uncivilized because they did not speak Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. So I just read to you the first major event that helped transform Western Europe and lead to the Middle Ages. And hopefully you remember from third grade that the Roman Empire grew too big for one emperor to rule. So it split into two parts. That split into two parts was an event that led to the Middle Ages. And we can look at the map. If we look down here at the map, we can see that, let me get a different, let's see, that color. We can see that the red is the Western Roman Empire and the purple is the Eastern Roman Empire. Rome was the capital of the Western Empire and Constantinople was the capital of the Eastern Empire. All right, page 4. Some of the most successful barbarian invaders were Germanic tribes such as the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Vandals. Friends, the term Germanic tribes, those are groups of people from what is now known as Germany. These tribes lived on the edges of the Roman Empire. As the Romans became unable to defend their borders, these tribes pushed further to the west. The Vandals looted towns and villages so badly that today we use the word vandalism to describe the destruction of property. The infamous so-called barbarians were the Huns from Central Asia. The author uses the phrase so-called barbarians here because even though barbarians might not have been that word barbarian might not have been the most suitable name, it is what the Romans called them. So, the most infamous so-called barbarians were the Huns from Central Asia. Attila the Hun led this nomadic tribe as they invaded parts of Europe in the 400s. As the Huns conquered, they drove the once dominant Germanic tribes even farther into the Western Roman Empire. Let's do some highlighting here. Let's find evidence on this page of events that helped transform Europe leading up to the Middle Ages. Well, we heard that there were Germanic tribes, and those Germanic tribes looted towns and villages. The barbarians, led by Attila the Hun, invaded parts of Europe in the 400s, and they drove, meaning they pushed, the Germanic tribes farther into the Western Roman Empire. So we had the tribes of Vandals and the tribes of barbarians pushing on the borders of what was the Roman Empire. Okay, page 5. As warlike tribes swept across Western Europe and powerful kings emerged, another transforming force appeared, the Christian Church. Throughout these years of change, many people turned to the church because it offered them a sense of stability and hope. The heart or center of the church was in Rome, the seat of the papacy. Papacy is the office or position of the Pope. Slowly, more and more groups of people became Christians, including the Germanic tribes. Over time, the church became even richer and more powerful than many kings and queens. It is this time, when the Roman Empire was no longer the only powerful force in Europe, that many historians consider to be the start of the Middle Ages. Roman, Germanic, and Christian ideas, as well as powerful kings, began to shape Western Europe. In one of the Germanic regions, a great ruler emerged. His name was Charles, and he took control of much of the land that later became France. Charles ruled for more than 45 years. He increased the size of his empire by gaining land in areas that are now part of Germany, Austria, Italy, and Spain. As king, Charles defended the authority of the church. He promoted the spread of Christianity. On Christmas Day in 800 CE, he was crowned Roman emperor by the Pope in Rome. His reputation was so great that later writers called him Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. So friends, on this page, we heard another event that happened in Europe that led up to the Middle Ages, and it's up in this first paragraph. Right here, the church became richer and more powerful than even many kings and queens. Okay? People turned to the church. More and more groups became Christians. That changed how Europe was going to function. And we also heard about Charles, who later became known as Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. Okay, next page. Charles encouraged new ideas and promoted an interest in education and art. To help him rule his empire, Charlemagne also encouraged a system of government that we now call feudalism. He gave land, instead of money, to those who worked for him in the military or government. The practice of paying men with land spread throughout other countries in Western Europe. So, why do you think Charlemagne became known as Charles the Great? Well, I can see it right here in this first paragraph. He did many things that people approved of, and many people believed he was a great man. He encouraged new ideas in art and education. He established a government we now call feudalism, and he paid people in land instead of money. So he encouraged new ideas in art, he established a new government, and he paid people with land instead of money. So, did these ideas listed in this paragraph lead to the Middle Ages? Certainly. Charlemagne's ideas about education, art, a system of government, and paying people with land instead of money were major transforming factors in the years leading up to the Middle Ages. Next paragraph. Life in the Middle Ages was not the same as it is now. For one thing, people who lived back then probably thought about time differently. Many people measured time by the rising and the setting of the sun and the passing of the seasons. For this reason, life likely had a slower, steadier pace. In addition, there was strong desire to honor God that appeared to transcend time. As a result, people undertook impressive long-term projects such as building magnificent cathedrals that took centuries to complete, hundreds of years. And if we look at this right here, this is the Cathedral of Cologne, and it took 632 years to build. See that? 632 years to build this cathedral. Language and location helped shape people's lives too. Because travel was so difficult, many people didn't do it. Generally, only rich, educated people in Europe traveled. Almost everyone else stayed close to home. Though Latin was the language of both the church and the government, only select members of society could understand that language. Most people lived an isolated existence. They did not travel far from home. As a result, most people communicated using the language or dialect spoken in the place of their birth. As strange as it may seem to us, in certain parts of Europe, villagers from places just 30 miles apart could not easily understand each other. For this reason, most people during the Middle Ages were concerned with the affairs of their village and what they owed the local lord in the way of payment and how to ensure their place in what they believed was heaven. So, this paragraph tells us a lot about the Middle Ages, and I noticed that it tells us that the people did not travel far from home, and they communicated using the language from where they were born, which means villagers just 30 miles apart couldn't understand each other. That'd be like us not being able to understand people that lived in Ithaca, really close by, but could not understand each other. Okay, let's take a look at this diagram. Okay, I see an up arrow, I see a down arrow, I see the king at the top, then the nobles and the lords and church leaders underneath, the middle class, merchants and craftsmen, and then freemen and serfs at the bottom. And the caption at the very bottom of the page says, although this diagram does not include every aspect of medieval feudal society, it does show the people with the most power at the top and the people with the least power at the bottom. All right, so this diagram shows the medieval feudal society system. All right, the higher the category on the diagram, the more power and wealth the people in that category had. So we can see that the kings had the most power and the most money. If I look at the left arrow, the arrow that says protection, the higher the people are in this society, the more protection they have. The lower they are in the society, the less protection they have. So lots of protection, less protection. Now if I look on the other side, I see an arrow on the right that's going in the other direction. Okay, this is the way where people were loyal. Okay, if I take a look at it, the ones below gave loyalty to the ones above. So the serfs gave loyalty to the middle class gave loyalty to the nobles, and the kings. Nobles gave loyalty to the king. So really, the serfs gave loyalty to all of these. The merchants, the middle class, gave loyalty to the nobles and the king. Okay, and the nobles gave their loyalty to the king. Okay, there was another force that had a huge impact on Western European society during the Middle Ages. This force came in the form of a deadly disease. The disease, called the Black Death or Plague, certainly made its mark upon medieval Europe. This dreadful plague first appeared in the 500s. In the second half of the 1300s, it swept through Europe once again. Spread by infected fleas that lived on rodents, the Black Death probably killed 1/3 of the population in Western Europe. So what event transformed Europe leading to the Middle Ages? The Black Death or the Plague, because it killed 1/3 of the population of Europe. Next paragraph. Despite conflicts and hardships, this period in history was also a time when people created impressive and inspiring architecture. Great castles and churches began to adorn the landscape. Kings and queens and noblemen held jousts, and court jesters entertained noble families. At the beginning of this paragraph, we see the word despite. When we see the word despite, it's a clue that we're going to read about something that happened even though other events might have prevented it from happening. And we read that a positive thing happened despite all of the negative things that were happening. The positive thing that happened was that impressive architecture was being created. This is positive because it provided beautiful buildings for the landscape during the Middle Ages. Okay, last page. This page has the title Medieval Musings. To muse over something is to think about it, and medieval means related to the Middle Ages. So here we're medieval musings, we're thinking about the Middle Ages. Okay, we're going to have medieval musings throughout this chapter, and these give us some time to think about other aspects of the Middle Ages. So let's look at the first question. In the Middle Ages, people used a pleasant-smelling plant, sometimes in their cooking, and to clean their teeth. What is the name of the plant? The first letter is an R. That was rosemary. We use rosemary in our cooking now. Question 2. There was an instrument that helps us to see faraway objects, such as stars. It was invented in the Middle Ages. What is the name of this instrument? Well, hopefully you said it was a telescope.